All right, it's 9:45. So we will. I will open up this public hearing for the House Election Law Committee. We'll start with the pledge real fast. Representative Bohm, you want to lead us up? All right, excellent. Going to open the public hearing for CACR 9 relative to the New Hampshire presidential primary, providing that the New Hampshire presidential primary will be the first presidential primary of a presidential election cycle. I believe Grant Bossy from the Senate is here to introduce the bill. Mr. Bossy, welcome to election law.
Good morning, Chairman Barry, members of the Election Law Committee. It's good to be back. My name is Grant Bossy from the New Hampshire Senate, introducing CACR 9 on behalf of Senator Darrell Abbas, its prime sponsor. A little history, not necessarily for the committee, but for anybody watching. It was first held in 1916 to select delegates to the Republican and Democratic National Conventions. In 1952, the first primary where voters directly voted for presidential candidates. Dwight Eisenhower upset Robert Taft. Since 1975, state law mandates that New Hampshire's primary be held at least a week before any similar contest, and the legislature has entrusted the Secretary of State with authority to move that date to make sure we stay first in the nation. Why is it important, not just for New Hampshire and our tourist industry and our vanity and our pride? Why is it important for the nation? New Hampshire voters expect candidates to earn their votes. Grassroots campaigns force candidates to persuade voters, making them better candidates and better prepared to serve as president. Winning in New Hampshire or having a surprisingly good showing can help candidates secure their party's nomination. A poor showing in New Hampshire can end a struggling campaign, narrowing the field for the upcoming contests. Protecting the First in the Nation primary is important. The current challenge to our primary is not from other states, Delaware or Arizona or Nevada, as it has been in the past, but from Washington, D.C. While the Republican National Committee has confirmed New Hampshire's status, the Democratic National Committee wants to move other states in front of us and threatens to not seat New Hampshire delegates if we indeed stay first in line with state law. In fact, last year, the DNC sent this legislature a list of changes to our state election laws just to be considered for the third or fourth slot in their calendar. CACR 9 would give New Hampshire voters the chance to cement our state's first in the nation primary into the state constitution. This is more than merely symbolic. It would also protect the primary from future demands that the legislature abandon first in the nation. Senator Abbas thanks you for your consideration and your support of CACR 9 and hopes you will send it to the voters in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? All right, because I've always wanted to do this to you, Grant, I'm going to gavel you down just so we can have a good laugh about it later. All right, with that, if there's anyone else wishing to speak to CACR 9, seeing none, Representative Wood, can you bring me the blue sheet? And he was gavelled down. I wanted that in the notes. He was gavelled down. No one signed up to speak either signed up for or against it. With that, I will close the public hearing for CACR 9 and end this public hearing for the House Election Law Committee. And I will see you all in 10 minutes for the subcommittee. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here at the second meeting of the House Election Law Subcommittee on Campaign Finance. And please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance as we begin the meeting. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, thank you again all for being here. The purpose of this subcommittee is to take a look at the campaign finance law in the state of New Hampshire and see if the interested parties here on the subcommittee can find some areas we agree could stand some improvement. And I see that our Secretary of State Scanlon is here, and thank you for coming. And we would be interested in hearing what legislation you think would be helpful to the Secretary of State's office, would be helpful in making improvements from your end, and also what improvements you have in mind and what your priorities are. So if you'd care to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm David Scanlon, Secretary of State, and with me is Bud Fitch, legal counsel to the office, and hopefully all of you know Bud. If you don't, then I'd suggest you get to know him because he really knows the election laws better than almost anybody else in the state of New Hampshire, hopefully including campaign finance laws. The position of our office on campaign finance generally has been that it's the realm of the legislature to determine the campaign finance policy and processes, and we administer the laws that the legislature passes. With that said, I think over time the campaign finance laws have become incredibly confusing and complicated to the point that even staff in my office have a difficult time, explaining how the law works to candidates and political committees. What I would like to see, and I am more than happy to help with this effort personally, through the summer, so that a bill could be sponsored next year, is to just consolidate the different types of political committees, streamline the statute as much as we can, have simple contribution requirements. And, the whole idea with campaign finance is transparency and disclosure. And it doesn't have to be that complicated. We just, if we just have a one-size-fits-all approach that we can keep really simple, I think that's to the benefit not only of the people who have to file these reports, but also the people that want to view them, and understand how campaigns are financed and where the money is going, will benefit everyone. So that's the 30,000 foot level of what the direction that I think we should go. I will say that at the moment, we are currently getting ready to replace the campaign finance online filing system. So this discussion is timely. We have already invited the political parties to provide input into what the new system should look like. But I think this exercise is a really important part of that. I'm going to turn this over to Bud now because he has done a lot of the work on the details, the detail part of the statutes, and he'll have some more specific comments and suggestions. So, Bud?
Thank you very much. Thank you, committee. I have a handout for you if I can approach and provide that.
Hey, bud,
Certainly.
can you go to the mic? Thank you.
Go, Jerry. So is a lot of information in the document that I've just handed out. It's intended to identify areas of the campaign finance law that we have struggled with, or we think it's so complex that it might benefit from being simplified. I'll proceed in any way you want to. Unless you direct something else, I'll just do a quick 30,000-foot overview of this, but not go into all the detail. And if you see an area that is of interest to you, you can read the further detail there. And I'm happy to take questions at any moment in time. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
That's fine. That's good. Thank you.
So the first issue that Secretary Scanlon referred to is there are 9 different types of registration if you parse the statute. And I've laid out in as much detail as I can what they probably are. In many cases, well, there are provisions in the statute that create each of the 9, and we try to construe them in a way that makes each mutually exclusive of the other. I can tell you our experience is that many of the people that use the system, people that file, see the list of 9 more as a menu choice where they get to pick and choose whichever one they want to, where in fact probably your intent was, or your predecessor's intent in creating these was that a particular individual or entity would only fit into one of them, and they would have to align with that. And there are components of them where the definition is tied to a particular amount of money either being received or expended, or received or expended. So some are both, some are one, some are the other. And so as I understand the law, they don't actually become a committee until they pass that threshold. So a political advocacy organization is defined as an entity that spends $5,000 on explicit advocacy communications. So even though they are subject to the reporting of political committees, and there's a law that says political committees start reporting when they hit 1,000, they're not a political committee. So as a lawyer, I look at that as saying, okay, the law has a 2-part test. Is it a political committee, yes or no? And if it is, then have they either received or expended or both, or either, I should say, the threshold amount of money? So a political advocacy organization, as I understand the law, would file its first report after expending $5,000 and only on that statutorily defined narrow form of expenditures. One of the things you'll see that's detailed in this is the question, and I'm not entirely, as a lawyer, I can craft an answer in either direction. Does a political advocacy organization, it can make contributions because your statute sets a contribution limit for it, but is a contribution an explicit communication? You know, we have the Buckley versus Vallejo line of federal cases that kind of say money is speech, but it's somewhat unclear whether the legislature intends that a political advocacy organization, which it said can make contributions because you've set limitations on how much they can provide, whether that is reportable. And I think the most courts that construe campaign finance statutes construe them like tax codes and other things where unless it clearly requires something, it's not required. This is not, you make your best guess of what they meant to do because it's restrictive in nature. What the courts find is restricted is just what the legislature has clearly defined. So the first few pages just go through the different types of registrant types. One area that I would encourage you to look carefully at is the distinctions between a candidate filing as a candidate and a candidate filing as a candidate committee. As we understand the law, and I detail it here, there are some differences in terms of how much they can give to somebody else and some other elements of the law, and there are differences in when they have to file reports. I would suggest a good question to think about is, what are the public policy benefits of that distinction? And are they outweighed by the harm caused by the confusion? A very common question is, all right, I'm going to run for office. Which of these do I do? And do I need a treasurer, or do I need a fiscal agent, or do you need both? And can they be the same person? We're a very simple thing that treats candidates and candidates who choose to work through a committee identically would make it easier for folks that are filing to understand. It would make it easier for folks who want to see where the money's coming from and going to be able to keep track of that. We then have these segregated fund organizations. we are reading into the statute, I think logically and reasonably, that to be a segregated fund political committee, you have to be part of an entity that exists in some legal form other than being a political committee. And you've got to have a fund that the political spending fund is segregated from. So this would not be something that just folks getting together to be a political committee would be able to do if their only existence was as a registered political committee. They need to be something else. And again, I'll leave the details for either your questions or you can read what I've tried to give you what would be most helpful. I think the major purpose electioneering and the major purpose not electioneering are areas that, one, create these differentials of when you become a committee that are confusing and hard for folks to sort out, and becomes enticing for someone that doesn't understand the structure to pick the one that gives them the most liberty, i.e. I'll make myself the one that doesn't have to report till I hit the higher amount of funds. Political advocacy organizations are a really difficult thing to kind of understand who they were intended to be, under what circumstances they exist. I've mentioned the issue of whether funds received for and used to make contributions to candidates are even reportable under the system by the political advocacy organization. It's not clear that they are under the statute, which probably translates to that they are not. So I provided on page 5, item 2, an explanation as best I can, what I typically tell folks when I end up on the phone or talking with them about should I form a committee or just file as a candidate, what I understand those distinctions to be. Reporting deadline, starting on page 6, item 3, and going forward, I've tried to lay out the reporting deadlines as we understand them, with columns for the candidate, which ones apply, and columns for a candidate committee, which also would apply to any other form of political committee, in terms of when folks need to submit their first report. On the bottom of page 7, you'll see there's some highlighted sections. This is probably one of the lighter lifts that, if you chose to, you could clean up the statute. Reporting deadlines are sometimes defined as you report funds received and expended up until the Monday preceding the filing, and in other places for other events, the same committee or the same candidate, but later for a different filing period, it's up to and including the Monday before the statement is due. Not a huge problem. A lot of people just report the Monday receipts and it's there, but it creates this, if they ask me a question and I need to give them a precise answer, well, which are you and at which filing deadline are you at, to know whether you stop what you got on Sunday is the last thing you have to report till later, or the last thing you received on Monday is part of the required reporting period. There are some duplicative reporting in the statute. Some of it may be purposeful, and I'm not suggesting the answer of whether it should be removed or not, but you should, as you consider this, be mindful. We have this system that requires the reporting of independent expenditures. The threshold is $1,000 in the aggregate, and then there's a 48-hour deadline after the expenditure to file that report. Those independent expenditure reports do not satisfy, as we understand the law, the periodic reporting requirements. So you would file a 48-hour independent expenditure report. You would also have to include that same expenditure in your report for the period in which the expenditure was made that you might be filing at a subsequent moment in time. Maybe a good reason for it. If not, then I'd encourage you to think about the pros and cons, the benefits versus cost of the system. The basic structure of the campaign finance law, as we understand it, is once you trigger a duty to report, you're reporting your receipts and your expenditures, and you have to keep reporting until you hit 0. So you can go beyond the end of the election. If you have a debt, you can go out and fundraise and raise more money to pay off that debt, but you have to file every 6 months until your account hits 0. For many, but not all of the folks who file, they are multi-election cycle participants in the process, and to the extent that they have a surplus, we encourage them to, but the law doesn't require, that they close out, I'll use as an example, their 2022 registration, their account when they open their 2024 and they bring their surplus down to zero by simply rolling that money forward. We understand the law to permit that. It's important as you think through this, though, to understand that if I'm a max donor and I give to somebody, and I have a limitation given that my characteristic as a donor in the 2022 cycle, I have to go back to zero for the 2024 cycle, notwithstanding that some of the money the person might roll or the committee might roll forward from 22 to 24 might include funds that came from me. In the past, our understanding of the Attorney General's approach to this is that's not violating a contribution limit unless there's no circumstance except that it is an excessive contribution. And most of these entities have contributions from many people. There's no practical way to or requirement to account which dollar is spent where. So once it's fungible in a pool of a larger amount, say I've given the full 30,000 that I could give or 15,000 depending on my characteristics, but who I gave it to had 50,000 and they spent 35 of it, the presumption is going to be that my 15 was part of the 35 they spent, not part of the 15 that rolls into the next year. But we are mindful as we look at the law and try to provide guidance on it. It's our understanding the Attorney General's office is mindful to be cautious that there aren't systematic things permitted that would allow somebody to go above the contribution limit but not be accountable for it. One of the areas, and it's addressed in the memo, is the issue of fundraising after an election to increase surplus. So we see some of this. We think it's not proper, but it is not clearly prohibited in the statute. And one of the concerns with fundraising after the election, if you have a surplus as of the election or paying off the debts that you may have accrued by the election, is that it's a way to go to your max donors or people who might be max donors in the next cycle, get them to contribute to the 2022 cycle, really just adding to the surplus, knowing that you're going to roll that forward, but in a way that doesn't attribute to the specific contributor. And then that contributor resets to zero and can again contribute to max in the 2024 cycle. So kind of a fine nuance, and I don't know that we have evidence that there's any kind of serious or rampant efforts to contribute beyond the limitation. So maybe a solution in search for a problem, that's your judgment call to make. But I've alerted you to that nuance, and that if it's your intent that election day, when I look at all my receipts and my expenditures and the debt that I hold at that moment, if I have a surplus, I probably shouldn't be doing a fundraising after election day that is just going to build my surplus more. It makes the process of keeping track of whether somebody contributed more than they're permitted to at least very difficult, if not impossible, and certainly at the enforcement level. Couple of, political advocacy organizations, whatever attention you're willing to give to them, if you choose to retain them in the system, anything to help us all understand what they are would be greatly appreciated. Just a couple more items. I'm almost done here. Item 9, there is a provision in 664:4 Roman 5 subsection 5 that says you can't make a contribution if made without the knowledge and written consent of the candidate or his fiscal agent, a political committee, or its treasurer, and not to any one of the same. I don't know of anybody who has made a contribution that goes and asks for a written permission slip before they do it. I'm not familiar with any campaigns that have a systematic process of alerting people that if you'd like to contribute to me, please get this written permission from me. So I think it's a provision in law that's not adhered to widely. I'm not sure what its function and purpose is, and would encourage you to look carefully at whether that's an area that you might bring a simplification to. Item 10 is RSA 664:7, the statute that requires candidates to report, and it has a phrase at the end of one of the sentences that reads, accepting, however, the expenditures of political committees of the party to which the candidate belongs in elections other than primaries. I think that could benefit from some clarification of what it is that the law is expecting. I think it means, in part, that an in-kind contribution made by the political committee of a political party, so it could be the Sullivan County Republican or Democratic Committee that is a political committee of a political party that's local, and if they hold a cookout and they buy the food and have some expenses with it, if somebody else did that and the candidate benefited from it, it is arguably at least an in-kind contribution. You have to sort out what that candidate's share of the cost was. Candidate would have to report it as an in-kind contribution. I think this phrase in the sentence means if it's the political committee of a political party, then it's not a contribution. It doesn't count towards what the candidate needs to report. The problem comes, I think some of these committees are making direct cash contributions to candidates, and either one of two things then needs to be true. Either that's also exempted, in which case the candidate brings it in, but either there's no accounting of it, or they have to keep a separate set of books for the exempt from reporting money they bring in and spend, or it's something that should be reported, but it's not clear that it should be in the wording of that phrase in that sentence. Probably more of a problem for the candidate, because they're probably going to book it in. And if they book it in, they've got to cover the expense, or they're never going to get to zero. They've got to show how it was expended. Again, I've kind of laid it out as clearly as I think I can, but I'm happy to answer questions at any point in the process, or we are. The last item is just a general recommendation that you look at some point in the future. We think the earliest probably should be the 2026 election cycle. Give us a chance to get the new system acquired, developed, and in place to some extent, but requiring most, if not all, people with a duty to file electronically. Anybody who spent any time looking at paper filings that we post on our website will know their utility is dramatically less than those who file electronically, in part just because you can't read the numbers. And the new cursive required education in high school maybe will help that out if that becomes law. But as a practical matter, having the values, the numbers typed makes it more realistic. Frankly, it's helpful to the filer, the candidate and the committee, to the extent that the campaign finance system, the old one that's going out, has some of this. We're trying to enhance it, and the new one coming in has tools that help them do the math and keep track and alert them that says, hey, you're saying that Bud Fitch, previously gave you $5,000 for the primary. You're now saying he's going to give you another $2,000. He's somebody who's subject, the way you've entered him, to the 5,000 limit. So probably you shouldn't accept that contribution. So there are tools that can help people who have a duty to file be compliant. It certainly makes it easier for the public or those who are interested, other candidates perhaps, in who raised how much from whom, to have numbers that they can actually read and understand. Online would assist that. Finally, and it's in that section 11, the default starting point under the statute, as we understand it, is everything that's turned into us is completely public. And anybody, for any reason, kind of a right to know law standard, can come and look at that information. To the extent we get it up on the website, they can, from wherever they want to, go there, and they can use it for any purpose that they want to. There's no constraint on how this information is used. One of the things that would be helpful to us is to have the ability to either encourage or require filers to provide a way to contact them, cell phone number and email address. But we know that many people either use the ones they don't have any time to get to for email addresses, or they have one, but they're careful who gets it so it doesn't become a source of spam or unwanted attention. So the legislature has, in other areas, created an exemption to the right to know law for phone numbers and emails provided to the Secretary of State's office or local election officials with the purpose of getting information about elections. So that is such that the fact that you email us or call us as a citizen asking us questions would be of interest to somebody running a campaign, because that flags that person as somebody who probably is going to go vote and is interested enough to be making inquiries. Today, before that law was passed, somebody could have done a right to know law request to us, and we would have been obligated to go find all those emails or cell phone numbers or phone numbers and give them out. We requested, the legislature made the law in that instance one that exempted it. Consider whether, if we add to the information presented to us, give us your cell phone number, we can reach you, or your email address, whether we can exempt it. It is more realistic for electronic filing because we simply build the system to not have it report that field on the things the public and others can look at. On paper, actually, please don't make it exempt because we then would have to pay human beings to go and create a redaction on the PDF scan of the filing in order for it to not be disclosed, unless it was disclosed in some separate way. Those are the highlights.
Thanks, Bud. Let me just give you a real-time example of the confusion that is out there. I've been fielding calls on this topic this week, and it's more than just a couple. Tomorrow, 6-month reports are due. And a 6-month report is a report that is required to be filed every 6 months by a candidate or a political committee that has not renewed its committee after the past election. So if there is a surplus or a negative balance in a campaign account, the candidate or the committee is responsible for filing 6-month reports until a zero balance is reached, at which point a final report is filed and there's no further obligation to file the report. If a candidate creates a candidate committee or a political committee is created for the 2024 cycle, then a balance that is left over from the last election can be transferred to the new committee, and then a final report can be filed for the past election, and there's no further obligation to file a 6-month report. New committees that are created are required to file their first report in June of this year. And so there is a lot of confusion about, what do you have to file? When do you have to file it? How do you transfer the funds to achieve that zero balance? And I think that if we can just consolidate those filing dates and make the transfer of balances to a new committee when it is renewed automatic, it would eliminate a lot of confusion and headaches and unintentional violations of the statute because the proper report didn't get filed. I know that, and I don't see the Attorney General's office represented here, but I would definitely suggest that you have them come in and offer their suggestions, because they are the ones that are responsible for the enforcement of the election law statutes, including campaign finance. And they just sent a round of letters out within the last month for reports that were not filed or properly filed from the 2020 election cycle. And, we're getting the calls from that saying, we don't have those records anymore. What do? We don't want to, we don't want to be in trouble. And so, I think that, more timely action when it's required is better, but I think we can eliminate a lot of the confusion and the need for the Attorney General's actions if we just simplify these statutes and make it easier for compliance. And I think that's your goal as well. So,
thank you. Well, I was one of those who called Matt yesterday for exactly this reason, because I have a surplus, and most of it's from my own, because it's also not clear if when I self-fund, if I'm supposed to put that in. That's another area of confusion is, do we want to, or transparency, do we want to require people who self-fund to at least show that and the amount? Not to put a limit on it, but it's in different parts of the statute. But I guess my question was, when I went into the system, there was no clear place for me to put that overage in. And I put in an amount, and then all of a sudden it bumped it up another, I'm at $500. So I just filed it and said, I hope this is the right way to do it because I was so confused. So I agree with you that we need to fix that, but I would also like any thoughts. And I saw, Mr. Fitch reaching for the thing about self-financing and
And then he
should
pushed
we?
it back in my direction.
Oh, okay.
If I may. So just a couple things to keep in mind. First, the case law suggests that the acceptable reason for regulating what is otherwise First Amendment free speech, political advertising, so the whole foundation of campaign finance law, is one of anti-corruption and disclosure. And the courts have very clearly said, I can't corrupt myself. So you have a limited ability under the Constitution to regulate how much of my money I spend for myself. There's no limit. I can spend as much of my own money as I want to as a candidate seeking election. And I would seek guidance from the Attorney General's office and tread carefully on kind of how much you regulate that. The current system certainly requires that if you report it, you've got to then keep dealing with it being there until such time as you expend it all, so you reach that magic zero amount to transfer. Complexities are these systems drive many candidates to loan their campaign money. So they're taking money out of their pocket, they're putting it in, they hope they get more popular with contributors, and at some point they could repay that debt back to themselves, and other people really underwrite the cost of the campaign. So it's fairly common to see in reports that a candidate has loaned himself or herself money. So then when they're in the circumstance you describe, I'm at the end of that, and you're going to run again, you probably want to roll it over and move it forward. But if you're not, you can't normally just pay yourself the surplus, but you could if you had booked it as a loan to your campaign. You also can forgive the loan at some point to get it off the books. If, yep, I spent it, it was my money, but I'm done, and I'm just going to forgive the loan, which post hoc converts it to being a self-contribution. So there are a host of complexities under the current statute that address those concerns. We're literally still hammering out the terms of the contract. We're working to make the new campaign finance system have enhanced help and to be easier to deal with those kinds of transitions that happen. I just note, Secretary Scanlon talked about the complexity of the transition period. One thing that can happen to the law, does happen, is I can have a 2022 committee that has debt. That doesn't prevent me. There's nothing in the law that prevents me from opening a 2024 committee. And depending upon who I owe that debt to, if it's a friendly person who loaned it to me who's not after me to pay it off, there may be reasons that I want to raise new money for 2024 without paying off the debt from 2022. So everything Dave said, layer on top of that you are simultaneously reporting for your 2022 that has debt, while you're now having to report for your 2024 that's coming in. And you've got to keep track with your donors when you get money from them, which that's for. And, the law is pretty flexible. If you have a cookout and there's a basket and some of your contributions just come with people either dropping checks into it or dropping cash into it, which is common in my experience, what happens, pretty much the law leaves it up to somebody to determine how that money was contributed. Was it for an exploratory phase? Was it for a primary phase? Was it for the general phase? And if you are somebody that has both a last cycle debt committee open and a new cycle fundraising committee open, presumably, unless they write on the check, Bud Fitch for Dog Catcher 2024, which would signal that the donor's intent is to constrain it to that, you as a candidate or whoever is doing that for the committee could sort that through. And I'll just quickly throw in another area you can think about is the federal law for campaign finance has a pretty structured process for when you get money that you need to give back. The state law is completely silent on it. I think the benefit of a system like the federal system that gives you a window of opportunity in which you can do that and there's no harm, no foul, recognizes the reality that, as in the scenario I just described, you or whoever manages your funds is going through the basket, maybe a day or two after the picnic before you realize that somebody gave you a check that is maxed out and so you need to give it back to them. But you want to get it booked and you have some duty to report it if there's an imminent deadline coming up, but you also want to get booked into that system how you give it back. adopting some provisions that describe what is the permissible period of time in which you have in which to refund a contribution that's not permissible would make things easier to understand and clear, and set a boundary for, okay, it's been more than 60 days, you've had time to get it back, or 90 days, or whatever you might choose. I think the federal was at one time at least 60 days. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to say that 40% of the 5 reps here had a problem similar to Representative Lane, because I made a similar, the details are a little different, but I made a similar call yesterday, and the best I can say is I made a good faith effort to comply, but I'm still don't understand the proper procedure. And any questions from our subcommittee?
Oh, yeah. I'll
Okay, Representative Muirhead?
How many years did you devote to studying physics?
I don't even want to say. It was a long, long time, and it seemed even longer.
Follow up?
Certainly.
So if this is difficult for you to understand how to comply, then we can presume that it's difficult for everybody.
I think that's valid, yes. Representative Lane?
Thank you. You talked about streamlining these different kinds of committees. And I guess, I'm a little concerned about how we would do that, because the committees are often created for very different purposes. We have PACs, super PACs, we have people who are doing independent expenditures. We have, so I don't know how to streamline them, because I want to make sure, because we are after transparency and disclosure. So do we just say everybody discloses, no matter what your purpose is?
I think the answer to that is yes. When I first started working in the Secretary of State's office, and it's more than 20 years ago now, that the definition of political committee was pretty simple. It was 2 or more persons organized for the purpose of supporting or opposing, a candidate
Right.
or a measure on the ballot. And ever since then, there's just been all of these additional provisions placed in there. And, it seems to me that a committee that is going to be engaged in the campaign process, one way or the other, could be just a single filing. It's a committee that is engaged in political activity during campaign season. And then there may be different types of expenditures, independent expenditures or whatever. There may have to be a separate entity for political advocacy because of federal laws and court cases. If an organization is a 501c4,
Yeah.
5 or 6, whatever, I mean, they don't have to list their contributors, but they should still list the amount of money that they have raised without those identifiers if they choose to keep that information private. It just seems to me that it's, that the transparent part of this should be the money that was raised and the money that was spent, and categorizing those funds so they're appropriately divulged. And then having reporting deadlines that are uniform and simple. And I think if we can streamline that as much as possible, it will benefit everyone. And there are different thresholds, as Bud mentioned, in the statute for when a particular entity currently kicks in as a political committee. I mean, just make it 1. Just have a single threshold. Excuse me, and have allow for generous contributions. Maybe eliminate the different phases of exploratory, primary, general, and just allow a single contributor to give X amount of dollars per election, to a candidate. And I think if we can do that, it will be just simpler for everybody to understand the process, and the transparency that everybody wants to see would certainly be there.
If I can just add in, there's a statute that says committees have to report when they pass the threshold. There's a statute that says candidates have to report when they pass the threshold. Both are defined terms. The law talks about exploratory committees. There's no statute that says an exploratory candidate has any duty to file a receipts and expenditure report, even though there are constraints on how much they can take in. And part of the struggle is that we live in a world where a lot of the people active are also active federally. And federally, a super PAC is a defined entity in their law. In New Hampshire, I try to push the word political committee. It's not even a political action committee, because that's not how you've defined it in the law, to try to help people think that, okay, if I'm talking state, I'm not talking super PAC or PAC or 524 or any of the multiple ways people have figured out how to move money federally. I'm just talking about a political committee. Now I may be talking about a political advocacy organization. We've made it more complex than it was when I first started working in it, but it's there. And I think that's part of the reality. Really active people who are well-intentioned have got it into their mind that there are things that exist because they exist on the federal side that exist on the state side, when in fact they don't. And that's part of the challenge of the complexity of the statute.
And thank you for this. This is wonderful. I spent the weekend rereading ours and trying to come up with a list, and we spent the last meeting doing the same thing, but yours is much, much better. So thank you so much. I guess part of me says, why do we need a threshold? Is that something that we see across other states? Is that, why is there a threshold? Do we need it?
If I can, I believe the threshold exists because there's frankly an amount of money changing hands to promote somebody's candidacy or to oppose it that just doesn't matter. If we're concerned about undue influence and we're concerned about knowing who our elected officials are influenced by, if I may use a state rep who runs a $600 campaign as an example, is there really public interest or concern about that, other than maybe the person running against her or him in the campaign? But as a general proposition, people volunteering to take a $100 a year job that takes tons and tons of hours probably isn't going to be unduly influenced by less than $600 or less than $1,000 of money coming and going. So my understanding of the legislative intent in having thresholds is in part that there are levels below which the public policy purpose for having the disclosure aren't satisfied because there's just not public interest. The goal of having disclosure so that if somebody's unduly influenced by a particular contributor or set of contributors with a particular point of view just isn't going to happen below a certain threshold of money.
Yes, Representative Ross.
Thank you. I have a couple, just while we've got you. How long does it take your office to turn around paper filings or filings that come in not through the CFIS system?
Whenever there are filing deadlines due and we receive the filings, I think that information gets scanned in pretty much the same day. If not, it's just a couple of days. We get it up fairly quickly.
I have a question. What proportion of the filings are by paper instead of online? Thank you.
I'm going to have to get that information to you. What I think that we are going to reach a point where it will be important for the legislature to decide that electronic filings are mandatory. What happens now is that even with some of the major candidates, and I'm talking, the top level candidates, believe that there is some benefit to not making their donor lists easily acceptable. And so some of them still file their reports on paper. And not only that, in between filings, we see font changes, we see spreadsheet columns change, things that make even the paper filings difficult to follow. And so, part of the process of being transparent and disclosure allows the general public to easily view and search for items that they're looking for. And so as long as the major candidates are not all uniformly providing the information into the electronic database, you get some information, but you're not able to see the whole picture. But again, that's a legislative decision to finally, go all the way and make it mandatory as opposed to giving the option.
So, thank you. So what I'm hearing here is that some submissions, you're certainly not saying it's deliberate, but it's almost as if it were an attempt to make it more difficult for people to receive the information that they're supposed to be provided. It's
Yes.
it's almost that bad.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Representative
Thank you.
Representative Muirhead.
Return to the question of the difference between the federal categories, say for committees, and the state categories. Would it be a correct takeaway to say that it would be an advantage if campaign finance law in the state used the same categories as exist in federal campaign law, or is that just an option?
I would be cautious with that approach just because while it's on its face or at the top level surface, the federal system is somewhat simpler than ours. Once you dig in a little bit, it is not at all. And so because of the use of the 501c4 through whatever categories, because of the different IRS provisions, I think it's 524s are one that was popular at one point. I don't know if they're used as much this day and age. There are a bunch of ways to do the things that our political committees do under the federal system that bring them outside of kind of the usual rules. And I think they do recognize both political action committees and super political action committees. So I don't know that that's simpler. What I do know, having spent a little time in my lifetime in that area, there's a whole lot more money being involved, and most of the campaigns of any significance have staff attorneys, staff accountants who only do campaign finance work under the federal law. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. And certainly we have some high-level office where there's likely enough money to fund that sort of thing, but we also have state rep and county attorney and sheriff races that are subject to the same set of laws where sheriff shouldn't have to hire an attorney or a CPA to report her or his campaign finance disclosures.
Yes.
I want to go back to the mandatory online filing because, as I've said before, this is something that I'm actually a supporter of for a variety of reasons. Is there a reason why you make your recommendation on your last page of 2026? Is there? I'm a public statement. I would love it if we did it in the next election. So, kind of like, why is your office's recommendation 3 years out and not the next year?
We're currently operating the old system. We're in the contracting phase, negotiating a contract for the new system. And while our goal is to have it available when the serious entries happen for 2024, I've never been involved in rolling out an online complicated database and reporting system that didn't have lots of problems and glitches that you have to work through. Making it mandatory at a point when you know that it's not going to be 100% smooth. We're going to do the best we can. We have high hopes that making it mandatory at a point when we can reasonably expect it to be settled down and most of the problems haven't been found and addressed, I think drove our 2026 recommendation.
Another question, not a follow-up to that. I want to go over to the exploratory candidates. It's another issue that I've raised. Is I just don't believe that should be a real thing unless you're actually exploring it. I think there was Union Leader article this last week about they called it a loophole. So can you kind of dig into that a little bit? I mean, I know it's somebody, they haven't made themselves into a candidate yet because they haven't said I am running, but they're actively raising funds. In this case, we have a candidate who's exploring, who's raised $100,000. Personally, I would make the statement that you're not exploring at that point if you've got six figures in your bank account. But can you kind of elaborate on like what would be? I would love to close that up. Just for the record, I would just love to close that up. And maybe this is a question more for the secretary, but if we were to define exploratory, would your office be amenable to if we made something like you can't raise or spend more than 5,000 after that you're not exploring?
If I'll start answering, and then Secretary may have something more to add to it. So as I have experienced the history, and I don't represent myself to know every element of it, this is something that evolved slowly over time. And there were people going back many cycles who weren't sure whether they wanted to run or not, and they wanted to do some polling. They wanted to test polling. This is higher level state offices, test some of the ideas that they wanted to advance and to see how well received they would be before they made the decision to actually become a candidate. So that's my understanding of how it evolved, and then it became exactly, I think, what you've described, and a third bite at the apple, an opportunity earlier in the process to get your major supporters, folks that are willing to give you as much as the law lets you get from them, to make some early contributions. And even though it might not yet be time to start running ads, which I think that date has moved further and further back in time from the actual election over the last couple decades, that you could pay somebody, your team that's going to develop your ads. There's work to be done that you needed money to pay for that evolved there. So one point. Second point, when does somebody become a candidate? So we have a statute that defines a candidate and says you become a candidate when you declare yourself as one. We have an Attorney General's office opinion or statement of its application of the law that, as far as I know, is still being applied. It dates back, I think it was Phil McLaughlin. Those who remember back that far, was the Attorney General where it came out, who said, this is too complicated. So if I'm making a speech and I say, I'm thinking about running for dog catcher, am I a candidate? I plan to run for dog catcher, am I a candidate? I'm going to file and seek election as dog catcher, I'm a candidate. Somebody can't be expected to have a Philadelphia lawyer beside them and coaching them as they make public statements, whether it's in a speech or to a reporter or however, and have that be the determinant of that they became a candidate. And from an enforcement perspective, you know, it isn't realistic that you're going to send out investigators to question or try to find audio videotapes of the statements the candidate made and then parse it to see. So the Attorney General's office said, for campaign finance purposes, you're going to become a candidate when you file for office in June. And until you do, we're not going to treat that as that. And I think that also promoted the recognition of, okay, but I've got to raise money and do things before then in the current environment while you're an exploratory candidate until you do that, until you make that formal declaration with the Secretary of State's office to officially become a candidate. Federally, I think there is, I haven't looked at this for a while, so check it. At one time, there was a dollar amount. If you raise or spend more than X dollars, you're a candidate, without consideration to whether you've made the decision to formally declare or not. So I think there are other approaches to setting that boundary. But frankly, the simplest one is the one the Secretary has suggested. Let's eliminate exploratory primary general. You can raise money. You have to report who you got it from, and then the public and your opponents and the press and everybody that's interested in that can look at how much that is. And if they think you're taking too much from a particular source or a particular interest group or whatever, that becomes part of the political debate. Secretary?
Yeah, and just more broadly, the interest of our office is that we have a law that is easy to administer. And so, you know, our concern is transparency, simplicity, the ability to explain how the law works, and to train the users. You know, issues related to, you know, when a person should become a candidate, you know, when can they really start raising funds? You know, I think those are policy decisions to be made by the legislature that are beyond, I think, our role in the process. And So we just want to be able to administer it, be able to explain it, and be able to enforce it. And then you guys get to decide the extracurricular stuff.
Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
just to restate that, it seems maybe possible for the purposes of campaign finance, if we don't have people declare or register as candidates or candidate committees at all, we just say any person or group that raises or spends X dollars for the sake of exploring or advancing a candidate or a measure must report that to the Secretary of State's office. And then for campaign finance, all these distinctions just go away. It's only are people or groups raising or spending X dollars.
That's making it pretty simple. There is, there is a line somewhere when you have an individual that is going to spend a lot of their own money on multiple candidates, and at what point does that person remain an individual, just simply giving contributions, or is there a point where that person becomes a committee that's trying to influence the outcome of election? That's an area for you to talk about. But as I mentioned before, it's just if we can just have a simple set of statutes that define the reporting process, it will be better for everyone.
I have a question, gentlemen. At what point do attempts to regulate speech, which is what political campaigning is, do you have a feel for when that comes up against the right to free speech guaranteed by the First Amendment? We just heard of a thought of someone raising money to get a message out on political matters, but that seems to be the heart of what's protected by the First Amendment. So how do we sort out where that hard limit, because if you're going to put it in statute, there has to be a hard limit at some point that's defined. How do we sort that out? That's a general question, but do you have some thoughts?
Certainly the courts seem to have looked at what is the permissible purpose for regulating free speech. And they have recognized that letting the public know who is funding campaigns and candidates in the interest of discouraging or making transparent if there's undue influence is permissible. I mean, we treat candidates and measures about the same in our law. No one's ever challenged that proposition, but certainly there are other contexts where the regulation of money, saying vote yes or no on this constitutional question, is viewed differently, because how do you corrupt a constitutional question, right? When you give money to a candidate and maybe you have a personal business interest or whatever, and there's a theory that for some donors and for some candidates, there's an amount of money that if you give them enough, that's going to influence how they act in their public office based on that contribution. That's what the whole system is designed to recognize. The courts have said, yep, the public at least gets to know about it in order to discourage and bring to light that kind of undue influence. Not sure this argument would ultimately survive on a measure.
Thank you.
So in the, I have to say, I have to go and step out and do a work thing here in 2 minutes. So I apologize if we're still around. After 20 minutes, I'll be back, but I want to get this in before I have to go, and the $100 a year, it just doesn't go that far. So we have 3 core organizations in general. We've got PACs, parties, and candidates, right? And from that, we have various splits. So one of the things that we could do is consolidate that. And I think consolidating parties is pretty easy. I think consolidating candidates is pretty easy. Consolidating PACs should be easy, with the exception of the Citizens United decision. So kind of assuming we wanted to consolidate that, which I imagine there would actually probably be some consensus on this, how would we consolidate political action committees and still be in compliance with the Citizen United decision?
So I haven't read Citizens United for a while. My recollection of it, it basically says that corporations that at one time were prohibited from making political contributions were recognized as persons and could. And so if you say whoever you are, you have to report the money you get from them, and we set some limit, maybe a single one for everything that's fairly high. It's unclear to me. You may understand it better than I do, and maybe there is something that implicates Citizens United, but I don't think it does. If a corporation can give money and you treat them like a person or like a committee, which political committees sometimes have a legal existence other than being a political committee, but most of them don't. So that's their sole entity. Causes them trouble when they try to get a bank account, but that's a whole separate discussion. So I cannot identify for you a boundary that Citizens United creates.
A follow-up that's absolutely not a follow-up because I'm just going full ADD brain right now. Parties and candidates. So when a party sends out a mailer that is not authorized by the candidate, the disclaimer has to read, paid for by so-and-so political, state committee, not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. But then there's nothing in there that says the candidate couldn't authorize it with their own party. And then we don't have to say, there's nothing in the provision that says authorized by the candidate or candidates committee. Is there do we know why that's not, it's just a huge gray area, right? So if they leave that off, is it to be inferred that the candidate approved of the mailer, or you see what I'm trying to get at? Like, is that another area that's confusing? Because it's definitely confusing to me.
I'll start answering, and the secretary may want to add to it. Yes, it's confusing. And if you can make it more clear, it certainly would help people sort through that. I think that my understanding of kind of the background of what's going on is the basic concept is that if a candidate and somebody else paying for communications that benefits the candidate coordinate in any way, it's an in-kind contribution. And then I brought your attention to earlier, the reporting statute for candidates has this phrase that I'm not entirely sure what it's meant to do, and nor what a court would ultimately find that it does do, that says you don't have to report things that are done by the political committee of a political party, which could be the state party, but it also could be one of the multitude of town and county and other political committees of political parties that exist. There are quite a number of them out there. I hope that's helpful.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be back in 20 minutes, just so you know. I have to go and pay the bills.
We're just gonna sit here and wait for you. No, you're not. No, you're not.
Thank you. Headed back to candidate versus candidate committee. I face this, we all face this when we start to run, and I think particularly in reps. Not all reps are small campaigns, but most of them are. Is there a reason that we need to differentiate, or is there some reason that people do that?
I think that is a part of the statute that has just evolved over a long period of time. That, there was a period of time before there were political committees, and candidates just reported to the extent they had to report as a candidate. And so the candidate statute continued to the present time, even though, there is a new addition now of candidate committee. And I think you're right that there are many candidates for state rep that just run as individual candidates and don't file a committee. It doesn't make much sense for them to do that. But I think when you get to the Senate, the major candidates there all have candidate committees. And I think the parties strongly suggest that they create one, and donors, frankly, like to know that they're contributing money to an entity as opposed to just giving money to a person sometimes.
I don't want to monopolize. What if we make reporting consistent for everybody, do you make it, and you can put in a threshold amount? They make it the first time, and then do you have them do it quarterly? I mean, what when you say consistently or at the same time, from a disclosure standpoint, is there a feeling, how often do you need to do that during the election cycle?
That is a determination of the legislature.
Okay.
Um, prior to maybe 6 years ago or 8 years ago, the reporting schedule was directly related to proximity to the election.
Mhm.
And so reports were required 1 week before the election, 3 weeks before the election, and then it might have been 8 weeks before the election. I think that's still in the statute. But then a more recent legislature decided that they also wanted to have reports filed in the year before the election, in June and December, I believe. So that created, additional requirements, but also, at the same time, they didn't try and sync that in with the 6-month reports that are filed. So now we have a report that's due tomorrow for 6-month reports, and then there'll be another report due a month later in June when committees that have filed have to make their first report of the 2024 election cycle.
Do we have further questions? Representative Muirhead?
Thank you. On the difference between a candidate committee and a candidate, just looking at this, I now realize that the candidate is triggered, to incurs a responsibility to report when the candidate has spent money, $1,000, including just spending their own money. But as you've explained it, the courts say that candidates can't corrupt themselves. So in principle, there's no public reason to force people to show how they're spending their money if it's their money. And the public really has a right to know who candidates are getting money from. So one possibility would be to eliminate the candidate reporting of spending of their own money and say that candidates have a duty to report only when they receive money from others, whatever that threshold might be. Could be low, it could be zero.
I think you're right. You're identifying an option that's available to you. I would think about that option in light of our experience in the last couple of decades where there are some pretty major self-funded campaigns. And do you want a circumstance where somebody who's not rich is running and raising money and spending it, and there's lots of transparency about what's coming and going, and their opponent is somebody who's sufficiently wealthy to spend millions of dollars, and public says, well, who's paying for that? Where's that's coming from? And if there's nothing reported, you can draw an inference, well, they must be self-funding, but do you know that? And I know federally there's been lots of cases and challenges, and I frankly don't even know the current state of the law. It's got to be the candidate's money, but does that include the candidate's spouse's money? Does it include the candidate's parents' money? I mean, you may have read the same stories I have where somebody's dad gave them some money for their campaign, and was dad kind of them, or is dad a separate entity who's subject to the constraints on how much can be given? So I think there's a rationale to support some level of reporting, but I think you've identified it's an option that's available.
Thank you, I really appreciate that. Nothing like being with an expert. I have one other question, if that's okay. I'm also curious about whether you think there's a rationale for the difference between Category 4 political committee segregated organization fund and political number 6 political committee major purpose, not electioneering.
I do not. I mean, I changed jobs along the way. I used to do a lot of this campaign finance when I worked at the AG's office. I did some other jobs for a while. I came back when I went to work for the Secretary of State, and frankly was a little bit unclear in my mind why some of these categories were created and what the objectives were. Using the words that were put into the law, I've done my best to try to understand them, but I don't have a good answer to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there is no requirement in the statute that candidates actually have to create a separate bank account for their campaign funds. They can run it through their personal finances as long as they keep good records of what's going where. Certainly, if we're asked the question, we would recommend that a candidate open an account where the funds are separate, just to kind of keep them out of trouble down the road. But then there are larger entities like, labor unions cannot, according to statute, make contributions to candidate directly from the union treasury. They can do it if they create a political committee. And so an entity like that, it might make sense to have a segregated fund for the political committee. It might be a good idea for corporations, which are, as Bud said, treated as individuals, to also have, a separate account for that purpose. But that's just the state of our statute.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Yes, please.
We haven't really reached consensus on this, but one of the things that I've been working on is that when an LLC gives money, they're often created just to give money, and they can give, and they're members, whether they're corporations or individuals, and it's a way to get around the individual cap, so that I could give $10,000 if that's the maximum, and then if Russ and I do an LLC, we can each give another 10,000 to the same one, but it's through that entity. So as an individual, we've gone over our limit. And both Democrats and Republicans have used this to raise a lot of money in our state and in other states. It's not just New Hampshire. So my thought is, how would that fit in if we have these various disclosure pieces? How would that fit in? I'm trying to fit it into this new rubric that we are working on. How would that fit in, or do you know, or am I just speculating too much?
I'll try to avoid any speculation. I think the question might be, the most helpful thought process maybe to step back. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve making information available to the public, the voters, and less directly, but probably more pertinently to the opposing candidate or the opposing candidate's party, the people who are watching the process and trying to be alert for things that they think the voters should be alerted to, of what's coming and going in that respect. And so I don't, nope. Excuse me. I think the complexity of trying to sort out, because it's LLCs, but if you form a corporation, the corporation is an independent person. If you look at the corporate structure of even relatively simple corporations, people in New Hampshire that are in the housing industry, where they're doing rental properties, most of them, for very prudent civil liability reasons, have each of those tied up in a separate legal corporate entity. And if they're in a position where they control the decisions that makes, it may be an insurmountable burden to try to carve out some further constraint on that. And if there's complete transparency, some theories of campaign finance regulation are, as long as it's transparent, let those who think it's not appropriate for somebody who controls 10 corporations and each makes individual contributions, simply draw the public's attention to that. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Do you want to?
Just to follow up on that, I guess the intuition is that you could create a legal entity. So I, as a person, am limited in how much I can give my fellow representative for his reelection campaign. But if I then create a legal entity that hides the fact that I gave it money, or doesn't list me as a contributor, and that legal entity, call it an LLC or just, a new corp or something, gives my friend, money, then I've been able to exceed the contribution limits by creating this thing and making my identity opaque. So it wouldn't be enough just to inform the public that I made a contribution up to the limit, and then that I contributed to New Corp, which made another contribution, because that would just be telling the public that I've escaped the contribution limits. I would still have succeeded at escaping the contribution limits. So do you think there's a good reason to somehow restrict people's ability to kind of pass through entities that then allow them to escape these thresholds?
I think a challenge that you face, and it isn't a good answer to your question, but it's the best one I can offer off the top of my head, is that if you closed the multiple corporation process, you could probably, somebody desiring to do what your hypothetical describes, could do the same thing through a political committee or through one of the 501c4, 5, 6 kind of entities that exist that may or may not become a political committee, as long as there are enough people willing to do it so that their record of their contributions from you show that this isn't just you doing it, they're probably going to achieve that end goal.
And the other thing that I would say that, part of this process is going to involve political decisions, policy decisions that, I don't think that that's a particular point that my office is interested in answering. I think that's something that the legislature has to decide. We're more concerned about the framework for that, again, the simplicity, transparency, and a process that's easy to administer. And you guys get to tie the bow on it. Yes.
And I appreciate that. I might be asking questions that really aren't, strictly speaking, germane to the work of your office, and therefore feel free to just pass on them. But I appreciate, there's a level of expertise and intimacy with the details of this really vexing area that just trying to extract some of that wisdom, even if it's not necessarily. And what I'm kind of hearing here is that for really sophisticated donors, big time donors, the contribution limits can be escaped. You can always create some sort of legal thing that allows you to escape them. And so I've heard people say we should just go for transparency and not try to cap donations, because the water is always going to find its way downhill and there's no way to stop it. And I'm not saying that that's your, settled, all things considered view, or that the Secretary of State's office should even have a view about that. But if there is a view, I guess, given all the expertise, all the things you've seen about whether contribution limits ultimately are kind of impossible to enforce, I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah, and at some point, letting the free market go, if I can use that term, is probably a good thing. But the other kind of abstract part of this is that you want to make sure that candidates can compete and that they have a fair shot. And granted, speech is money, but money can buy a lot of influence. And I think that's a different issue that is a part of this discussion. And the question is, how do you maintain a relatively fair playing field, for the candidates that are going to participate in the election process?
Okay, any other questions at this point, please? Go
I
ahead.
just want to thank you. This has been really helpful.
Yeah.
And we will be taking you up on your offer. I don't know if that included Mr. Fitch or not, but
Well, I've been saying that, we need to really take a look at that part of the statute, the whole chapter for years. And it seems like this is a good opportunity to really finally dig into it.
Yes, thank you for being here. And I also found it very helpful also having a write-up, because trying to take adequate notes on such a interesting and involved discussion is impossible. And I do have the distinct impression from your speaking with us today that the emphasis of the Secretary of State's office is really to have a set of statutes that are unambiguous and clear and don't have conflicts and therefore are not confusing. And I can see where you would draw a clear distinction between that and policy questions. So thank you again very much. I know we're all very busy, but you guys are particularly busy in your office, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Okay. Well, I found this very useful myself.
And do you know whether the Attorney General's office will be visiting this working group? No, seriously, not.
Well,
not- not- Not in the,
Rep-
you're trying, okay.
Representative Lane has made a distinct effort to get in touch with them, and so far hasn't completed the connection for reasons beyond her control. So
I got a
that
letter from them the other day. They'll answer my call.
yeah, the short version of my answer is it's being worked on, and we're hopeful that we will hear from them.
And I only ask that, I mean, again, because the questions about what can be administered by the Secretary of State's office are vital, but also what can be enforced. And that's, I was asking questions about what can we enforce, and the Secretary of State, is wisely saying that's not what we do.
Right.
But of course, it is what the AG does.
Yep. So we have 37 minutes left in the time we have scheduled for today. And how would we as a committee like to make best use of that? You want to pick up where we ended go ahead.
I just have to confess, I have to be back in Hanover at 1, so I'm gonna have to leave at 1:15, and I don't
okay.
have as much time as everyone else.
All right, thank you for letting me know. And here's Representative Ross. We just concluded our visit with the Secretary of State and
Perfect timing.
Mr. Fitch. And the question is, where would we like to go for the next half hour or so with this meeting?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking for your opinion, yes. This is a committee, means a joint effort. And
I honestly, I'd like to hear kind of people's thoughts, because this is obviously very campaign finance heavy side of it, the actual money side of it. I'd like to kind of gather what everybody's thoughts are, or like preliminary ideas. I'm happy to start off with what my thoughts are, but I think I said something to the secretary, but I'd kind of like to know, find some early areas of consensus, if you will.
I like that, yeah.
all right, please begin.
Or just, initial reactions.
So I wholeheartedly agree with the overarching concept, which is we should streamline this down, make it consistent across the board. So things that I think I'd like to see is, one contribution limit for all various organizations. So PACs, candidates, committees, parties across the board, whatever that number is, we can haggle over that number. If it wants to go up, down, stay the same, meet in the middle, whatever. I think I could definitely get on board with it just being one number. I can definitely get on board with getting rid of the multitude of different organizations and going down to 3. PACs, parties, and candidates. And then I think one of the things we should look at closing is not allowing candidates to set up committees specifically for 1 year. So I think a candidate or a candidates committee, whatever we want to end up calling them, should be tied to that individual candidate, and it just carries until they get to their zero balance. So they can't do Barry 2022, Barry 2024, Barry 2026. It's just Barry for New Hampshire. You see what I'm saying? So they can't debt load. They can't basically use debt load as a way to get around contribution issues.
Yeah, would you say that one more time?
So one of the things he talked about, which was a very nuanced way of kind of I don't want to say dodging, but because it's not really dodging, it's just not in the spirit of the law, if you will, is they'll set up organizations that live and die cycle to cycle. And instead of that, just making it, as long as you are an active candidate seeking office or intending to seek office or actively raising money, that is your organization. So it's not Barry 2022, it's Barry for New Hampshire. And Barry for New Hampshire operates until Barry for New Hampshire hits 0. I think another one, just on the dates, I would love to see the 6th month raising money after the election. I think is ridiculous. I could see a world in which it's like a week if you have, you got to pay off whatever. But I think after a week, you're on to the next cycle. We're on to the next thing. So I think that's an area of just in that and move on. If you raise money a week after the general election, you are now raising money for the next election.
I think that would fit in with the idea of just having a committee that continually exists until it goes to 0.
Well, you have to have a cycle reset date. Because if you don't,
Because of the contribution limits.
correct. You have to have a cycle reset date. So right now our cycle reset date is like 6 months after the election, which is ridiculous. Or I think it's December actually.
There's one in December and then there's the
Yeah.
6 month one.
Yeah, correct. So I would just love to see the cycle reset date a week after the election.
Would that interfere with somebody continuing to raise money to settle a debt?
Well,
Yeah.
it would. However, they're into the next cycle, so you could actually make the
Not
statement
really.
that it's.
They're paying their debts for the
But-
election they just finished. So that's really that election.
But it carries it forward, and that's the whole point. Like if their organization is going to keep carrying forward, it actually gives them access to the money faster to pay it off, because they can go back to so and so donor.
But
Say,
then
hey,
they'd be
you know,
raising
it's
money against the limits for the next cycle.
Yeah, but they have debt. They got to get rid of their debt. I don't know. I mean, the debt stuff is not used. The way I've normally seen debt used is it's to what their point is, which is a candidate will come in, they'll front load their election, and they're just paying themselves back. It's not like Ross Berry don't go loan Jim Qualey, $20,000 for your election or whatever it is. It's candidate debt. I've never seen. In fact, I've never seen a debt that wasn't candidate debt. Because no vendor will go on terms with a candidate.
Right, or
committee.
family debt.
Correct, family debt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would the recycle date in terms of accepting say that up to 6 months later, you're still raising money to apply to the 2022 campaign, not the 2024.
Yeah.
As long as it's transparent and people know that you're doing that and it's reported as such.
I have
Peop-
a philosophical problem with raising money for an election that's already occurred.
I have a philosophical problem with any limits on free
Yeah, I know-
speech
I know you
whatsoever.
do. I know
So
you do.
that's where my philosophical problem kicks in, is immediately.
Well, I
But-
guess I don't have that same problem if you're being transparent about it and you're raising the money to pay off debt that you incurred and you just, like the last minute you did a huge mailing thing
Yeah.
and you're raising, you've got people,
Mhm.
out there, you're paying yourself off or however they're doing it, as long as you're transparent about it and it was for that election.
So how long would you have to do that? Because I mean, in theory, I could do that for an election, and then 2 years later, be like, "Yeah, I'm paying off my 2022 debt. So give me the limit's 10K, but you can give me 20 because I'm going to send that first 10K back to that mailer that's already gone out."
I don't know what would be a reasonable, whatever a reasonable, I mean, for me, the 6 months thing seems to work, or do
Okay.
you just do the end of the year? I mean, part of me is it's a bit arbitrary, but,
Well, it's entirely arbitrary. I mean,
and then you want to tie it into when does the next cycle begin? So whenever that thing is, that date is, that's the
Yeah.
next cycle.
so
But yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. So when does the next cycle begin?
Whenever the first one is.
I'm
I mean,
totally on board with everything you just said. Just when does it begin? Is it Jan 1? Because that makes some sense. Like you can make that
Yeah.
argument to me. You can make January 1 of the next odd year is the beginning of a brand new cycle, and that kind of keeps it in December. 6 months is a long time for me, but I'm not
Well, it-
dying on that hill.
If the concern is with transparency and the contributions received and applied towards a debt incurred in the previous election, it's all reported and it's all readily obtained by the public,
Right.
which would be the case if we did go to mandatory, which would be more the case if we went to a requirement that reports be be readable.
We
Right.
actually already have that requirement.
But it doesn't seem to be working too well from the testimony we just heard. Anyway, if it's all transparent and people can readily look it up, then they know the facts and they can make their own judgments regarding what the candidate's doing with the money and where it came from.
I guess the situation I'm
Russ,
trying to avoid. I'm sorry.
I mean,
I'm
I
not really
think
sure.
now, just on your point, I'm not sure. I think this might be a bit of a corner case because you're imagining a campaign that's carrying a debt that's going to go try to raise money to pay off the debt from the previous campaign, while it also might want to raise money for a future campaign.
Correct.
And the people who would give money to the past debt and to the next campaign are people who are super supportive because they have a lot of money, but B, didn't max out in the previous campaign.
Right.
And so your super supportive, super wealthy contributors probably maxed out in the previous campaign. You can't raise more money for them from the past cycle anyway. Now, so we're talking about a very small number of potential supporters who would be giving you money after the election to retire debt right up to the limit and then give you money again for the next cycle.
Correct, but that's not how the money would work. So what would happen? This is the situation I'm trying to avoid. Let's say I'm running for governor, God forbid.
Yeah, we agree.
Yes, and immediately the pitchforks are sharpened, and immediately the torches are lit.
Well, it was just too easy.
And I take $100,000 of my money and I shove it into my race as a loan, and I spend all $100,000 of that money, right? And let's just say the contribution limit per cycle is $20,000 for a candidate, whatever it is. Let's say it's 20. We're obviously about to tinker with all this, so let's say it's $20,000. So I go out and I spend my $100,000, and I have this $100,000 in debt, and then God forbid I win my election for governor, right? So I am now going to be, in fact, even under a sim deadline, I am now governor of the state of New Hampshire. There's a really scary thing. I can now go to, John Doe super donor who didn't support me in my race for governor, and I can say, yo, give me 20 grand for the last election, and also give me 20 grand for the next election. That's 40 grand. I'm going to say it's going to debt, wink, 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 nudge, nudge. And the reality is I'm just going to take that 20 grand on paper. I'm going to pay myself off and then roll it right back into the next election. So that a person has effectively just given me 40 grand under the guise of paying off debt, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Because unlike the federal requirements, you're required to have separate bank accounts and all that sort of stuff. Under our law, we're supposed to have segregated funds. We don't actually define what that means. It can literally be paper segregated. So it's all just how you're accounting for it. And I guess that's my complaint for it is like, if you want to go to unlimited contributions, you got to go to unlimited contributions, like whatever. Many states have that. But if we're going to allow people to donate to a campaign after the fact under the guise that they're paying off debt, and I just know from working in that industry that paying off of debt is going to magically get rolled. Because I'll tell you what will happen. It'd be like, oh, I just paid off $20,000 of my campaign debt, and now I'm going to loan myself $20,000 into the next year conveniently. And I wonder where the money came from.
But this would all be transparent. We would know who donated money when.
Yeah, it would be transparent, except for it's an accounting trick. If the whole goal of this is to simplify this and get it straightforward, I guess my statement is we should limit the ability to use accounting tricks. And I know that debt is an accounting trick. I know that the debt is an accounting trick for these people, because once these candidates put their own money into the race, I'm telling you, it is gone. They have no expectation it's actually coming back. And you could even make an argument to me that they probably shouldn't be getting it paid back, because you want to talk about corruption, that actually looks even worse.
But I guess, and maybe I'm just not realistic, could if the date is January 1 and they want to raise the money and they go to this guy and say, I want 20,000. I mean, part of it is you can't start getting money for your new election until January 1. I don't know.
You can roll the balance forward, right? So, I mean, once again, it's an accounting trick.
Well, the balance it's a debt. So you're just going to roll the debt forward and you're still going to have the debt.
On paper, and then you're going to inject more debt on the other side.
Or raise more. Yeah,
it's like I said, it's an accounting. The debt is an accounting trick.
It's
an accounting trick.
If the objective is transparency, by which I think we mean knowing who contributed monies over a certain threshold to a candidate, then we still are be able to track that.
Yes, no, that part
we
of it
will
I'm
know
not
that.
concerned about. That part I'm not concerned about. That I'm trying
Right,
to.
but there'll still be pardon me for continuing. there's still a limit for a given campaign. Again, I'm kind of violates my principles of free speech, but that's beside. I understand the notion of having to balance requirements. All right. So you still have a limit for the 2022 campaign, and we know who contributed money under that limit. And we'll know the same for the 2024 campaign. Now, you were talking about what's the cutoff for contributing to a 2022 campaign. Well, it seems reasonable to me that, reasonable, what a word, huh? But it seems reasonable to me that we we try to structure a deadline that is sufficiently in advance of the next campaign that it's seems clear the money's going to the previous campaign. I don't know, like January 1st of 2024, for example. At least among state reps, we're working on much shorter schedules than the bigger campaigns. But say after January 1st, you can no longer contribute to the previous even year's campaign. That's a thought.
Yeah, no, I would get on board with that. Like, well, as long as there's just a cutoff date that's uniform and makes sense and doesn't allow, because I kind of share that worldview of it should be transparency, but when you try to apply limits, like I heard what Representative Muir said, but I just if the goal here is to limit the abilities to get around the law, you have to make it tight and you have to make it consistent. But you also, to the point, you have to be able to pay off debt, like legitimate debt. You have to be paid off. But I guess I just want the committee to be wary of the idea of somebody wins elected office, they're carrying this debt, and now they can go to this person who did nothing for them in 2022, and now that person who may have an interest.
No,
now
I
that person holds
understand.
elected office,
I understood
now
your
wants to
point.
double dip that money.
But there's a question of balancing things. On a slightly different topic, by the way, related, of course, but I do agree that there needs to be a threshold below which individuals' contributions don't have to be identified by name, because there's a long tradition of anonymous public political speech, right? The Federalist Papers were issued under pseudonyms.
Correct.
And that's not the only example. That's just a general thought.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I spoke to this on the first day. I think getting things like people's employer's address is arbitrary and overly burdensome, and to what end? If somebody's donating $10,000, I think we all know who they work for, whether or not they put it on their file or not.
Right.
That's not just some walking around money,
And as Secretary of State Scanlon and Mr. Fitch pointed out, it's a question of how much money is likely to cause an undue influence. That's a judgment call.
I thought that was an interesting,
Mhm.
because how do you balance that? I don't know.
You said a number.
And we've got, right, but do you do it by race? Because, 5,000 is a lot to me. I mean, like, a lot.
I consider that real money. Yeah.
Yeah. And,
I
but-
consider a quarter real
but
money.
to the governor, yeah, exactly. But for the governor, that's a drop in the bucket, So I don't know whether we set the same amount for every race, which I think is easier to monitor. I mean, but anyway, I don't know, but I just thought it was an interesting.
To that point, I think if the goal is to streamline this and make it uniform, it should be uniform. And there is this, $5,000 to governor may not be a lot, but $5,000 to a state rep as a whole, like, that's a lot. That's a lot of money.
1,000.
$1,000 of money, but I do think whatever we set that number at, I think it actually should be the same across the board, across all of it. Because the reality is if somebody's raising whatever the number is, I wouldn't set it at 5,000. That's too hot. That's not low enough.
Right.
That's too high.
Another impression I was left with is that there's a considerable amount of low-hanging fruit that we could pluck to improve things in terms of the laws being consistent and less subject to misinterpretation. The example that Representative Lane and I have in common with the current online campaign finance system, I still don't know exactly what the right answer was.
I don't either.
In fact, when I hit submit yesterday, I got a message that said, this transaction cannot be processed. And yet when I looked at the list of reports I had filed, the report I had just attempted to file was there.
Yeah.
So that's why I said earlier, I put a fair bit of time into trying to do this right and made a good faith effort to get it right. And I believe my information is now publicly accessible.
And
But there's the glitches like that, right? You've run across the same thing?
Yeah, it did exactly the same thing.
So not
And-
just me, good.
And it showed, because I thought what they told me to do, and then it showed up that I actually had 500 instead of 500, because they said, what's the amount of the excess? And it was 500. and something. And so I put that in, and then what it did is it showed that as being raised.
Right.
So it looks like it's not right, but I don't know how to fix it.
I experimented some with that. And I think I got an answer that's correct. When asked in that portion of the site to put in the
Yeah.
amount you're carrying forward, it's the amount that you carried forward into the 2022 campaign, not the amount you're
Oh.
carrying forward from. Because when I did that, their numbers agreed with my own spreadsheet.
Okay, I think I'll be amending mine.
Yeah, try that. Because
I mean, to the
I had the same, sounds like we had exactly the same, a very similar situation.
to that point, one of the things that I do think we should discuss is I think we're going to be able to get on board collectively
Yes.
on the streamlining, on the simplification, on the universal dates. I think we're going to get there. One of the things that I think we should consider is some form of either amnesty or forgiveness period, or let's call it reconciliation into the new laws, so that people whose math doesn't add up or they're confused or whatever can just say, I've got $1,200 in my account. It's from these other campaigns, and we're all moving forward now. It's just something that if you want to bring as many people out of the shadows as possible, I think you have to do something like that. And you just have to move on. And then from that point, the Attorney General's office can then take more robust enforcement, because you've gotten the massive come out of the shadow period, if you will. Oh, wow. Former member of election law joining us today.
Greetings.
But anyways, I just think it's something to say. It's going to be something that I'm sure somebody's going to tweet nasty things about it. But I think if the goal is to open up transparency, streamline things, you need to bring as many people into the fold as possible and give them every incentive to do so. And then after that, you can highly disincentivize them coming out of the fold with your $50 a day fines that they sent out in those letters that I definitely didn't receive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
It's gonna be a wholesale rewriting of this whole chapter.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
It's going to be a whole. I mean, look, it's
Okay,
it's
Excuse me, it's going to be a what?
a wholesale rewriting of this chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, it has to be.
yeah.
Otherwise, what are we doing? We're just gonna
I
sit
know.
here and fight over the numbers and
Right.
like I really I love you guys. I just don't want to waste 6 hours of my life here.
Well, I don't find your presence to be a waste. Let me reassure you.
If we don't do anything, it's definitely a waste.
Right. Correct.
Yeah. No, it's like, okay.
Well, I think of it as trying to put the laws through a clarifying filter.
Yeah.
If we just make them more consistent
Right.
and easy and simpler to comply with, while still achieving the basic objective of transparency.
Okay.
That seems to me that's what I'm getting out of this. That's kind of our objective. I'm sure we can do it.
So,
I expect we can find something we can actually find that we can all agree on.
oh, I do too. I just think the devil's always in the details when you start writing it. I think conceptually we can. But so do we want to start tackling that? Do we wait?
I think we should start tackling it.
Because we're not going to get anything passed, right? I mean, now we're doing a report, right?
We don't even know. We're a subcommittee. We're
Right.
not handling a piece of legislation. So I mean, we can.
We can take as long as
We can take as long as we want. My goal with this and in agreeing to do this was that we would come to a consensus on something, and that the committee as a whole would then co-sponsor legislation in the next filing period.
Okay.
Something that all 6 of us can get on board with to show strength and unity of that. And I'm
Okay.
sure that there will be ideas outside of that, and they will be handled outside of that. But then we can power something forward that's actually that we can say Republicans and Democrats are on board in this historically partisan committee, but we all agree on this, and we can pass it forward, and that gives us the best opportunity to send it through to our friends on the other side of the wall, who will then do God knows what with it.
Well, from my perspective, the first step would be to write out something that's doesn't have to be long, but just spelling out what requirements we think the campaign finance system has to meet. For example, establish transparency in the campaign the flow of campaign money. Uh, That's one requirement, but there's going to be subsidiary requirements because there's other things we need to respect. I think we need to respect the ability of people who are not contributing amounts of money that could be construed as having undue influence on a candidate. I think that we need to protect their ability to donate anonymously, especially in a political environment that can become very polarized and contentious. We don't want people to have to worry that they're, if it's a modest amount of money, we don't want them worrying about blowback from
And
a
we have that
contention. Do you
now.
understand what I'm saying by that?
Yeah.
We don't want to discourage people from contributing to
Right.
candidates because every last penny is subject to attack from somebody that they've never met. Does that make sense?
Right, is that, but I guess I would want that to be a minimal amount.
Well, that's where discussion comes in.
Yeah.
Well, there's something like
I'm
that
just-
now.
Yeah,
It's-
25.
There is,
I
it's,
think
it's,
I think
it's,
it's
it's,
50.
we raised it
anything
from
under 50,
25 to 50 the
Yeah.
last biennium.
and then it's anything over 200. That's when the employer information kicks in.
Right, but I'm saying we need to preserve that. And what that exact level is, we have to discuss. But that's like a requirement that we have a protection in there. But,
You know, I agree, and I would make the argument that 50 is too low.
and that's part of the discussion, but there needs to be a limit below which someone can make a donation to a candidate. And the fact that that candidate received the money from somebody is a reasonable requirement.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm just giving an example of, you got a donation of $50, say, you record that and report it. I'm just giving an example. It's not just transparency. There are other requirements we also have to meet. I'll be thinking about that myself. And that might be something good to spend a little time on at our next meeting to see if we have, how much overlap we have between what we see the requirements being. That
So-
next meeting will be next Tuesday, by the way. And that doesn't need to be the last meeting. We could meet again. This is not going to be a short-term effort.
No,
This, right.
the wholesale rewrite. To
I,
your- to your-
I took it as published on the state website, the portion, 664. All I did was a little formatting so I could read it easier, but this is it here. It's probably, about 20 pages. Single spaced, that's the campaign finance stuff. So it's not going to be a short-term effort to run through that and get it internally consistent while still meeting the requirements, which I think we should define first. Okay, I have to ask, is this making sense to people? So for our next meeting, it would be a good idea, I think, to at least have some preliminary ideas on what the requirements would be. And is anyone here averse to having future meetings, maybe monthly?
we just need to make sure we time it that we're meeting frequently enough to get
Yeah.
the work done inside of the filing window. Because I imagine we'll have,
But we're going to try to, it's November, right?
I should know. I don't
It's
know.
later in the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's later in the year. Yeah, and then but the state house is also closed at a certain point. That doesn't mean we can't meet at another location. You just have to go get the speaker's blessing, and last time I did
Okay.
that, I got a little bit of pushback, but
Anyway, we can discuss that further.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, that's great. I just can't meet in September.
Okay.
Oh.
That's when you want to have all the meetings, right?
I think we should only meet in September. I
Okay.
think we should-
All right.
Okay, so we're
yeah,
meeting
no,
next Tuesday?
I think we need to meet once a month. May not be. I mean, that might be a big.
Yeah,
too
I'm not
big of a
being,
gap.
I'm just,
Yeah.
again, this is just kind of, I guess the main thought I have here really is that if we're actually going to make any progress, it doesn't seem like we can do anything with only one more meeting. That's my main point. Scheduling, I'm not talking about here, but it looks like we'll have to have a few more meetings.
I think at our next meeting, one of the things that I think we could easily do is come to a consensus on what the reporting date should be. And it sounds like nobody really gave pushback to making those reporting dates uniform across the board for all various organizations. So I think people should come to the next one with an idea of what what you think that should look like. And
Okay.
then we can,
That's
can
that's,
go from there.
yeah, okay. That makes sense. I still think we need to have a good, my experience was as a systems engineer where you start with requirements and you flow it down. And when you're dealing with a complicated system, and that's what this is, that is a good approach, but it doesn't mean we can't do some of the details we think we already understand that would apply. So that's an example.
I'm almost tempted to do a Control-A-Delete, but
You almost
that
tempted
might
to,
be too much.
What?
The Control-Alt-Delete, Control-A-Delete, and start again. It's just so nasty, but
oh,
it's,
Yeah, I started working on it over the weekend and yesterday on definitions that we had talked about. So
Mhm.
kind of, and got it incredibly confused. So, because every time you change something, it's like.
Right.
yeah, there's the ripple effect, which is why something like a fresh start should
Right.
not entirely be out of out of discussion.
but it would
Because it
also
is
be
so-
satisfying to make some short-term progress as well to encourage us. Like, for example, come up with a uniform set of reporting dates.
Yeah, well, I think what we should do is we should come up with a uniform set of principles,
Right.
general concepts that we can all agree upon,
Oh, that's the requirements I was talking about, I
Yeah.
think.
and then so general set of principles we all agree upon, and then build almost just build from there what that looks like, and we have our current RSA that we can look at for reference and make sure that things that don't fall through the cracks. But that's honestly, when you're touching something as complicated as this and as dense as this, you really, to Representative Lane's point, it's really hard to go and touch something that doesn't ripple effect and then set off a bunch of firestorms. It may actually be easier just to pull it out and put a new engine under the hood.
So,
Well, yeah, and as I was saying, we're not going to do that with one more meeting.
No,
So we can discuss when the next meeting should be next week.
So can
right.
I just want to clarify something in my mind that you want. Political committee, that's going to include, does that include all these independent expenditures groups that don't coordinate with campaign? I mean, I just want to figure out, because I think a lot of this gets complicated because they were addressing different kinds of entities as they kind of came into existence. So I'm just trying to figure out when we go through and get that, the three areas, PACs, committees, and candidates, what distinguishes a PAC from a committee?
a PAC party, PACs, parties, and candidates.
Oh, PACs, parties.
Yeah. And I think one of the things to look at when we're doing
Okay,
this is
so-
how the feds handled the McCain-Feingold transition, because they moved from basically the world of kind of lawless federal elections into a highly structured
You're right.
thing. So it's kind of I do want to, maybe I'll ask Christina to take a look at how the feds handled that transition.
Okay. Because I started looking at the Fed stuff a little bit just to try and figure out, so, but for us then, it's going to be the term political committee, or whether we call it political action committee or whatever, is going to be all different kinds of committees?
I don't know. I haven't really thought that through.
I think my goal would be to make one overarching political action committee, PAC, whatever you want to call it, political committee, whatever name we give it,
Right.
the not party, not candidate political arm,
Okay.
right? And make it have universal rules, universal contribution limits, and universal guiding things of what they can do. They cannot coordinate with candidates and political parties, right? So they can't coordinate. They're their own separate entity. That's Barry and Lane getting together, two people getting $1,000 and starting to spend money on people, which would be interesting. But that would be my idealistic view. We would get to that world, which is why I asked the question about how do we handle things like Citizens United with super PACs and that sort of thing. Because I think one of the things that Attorney Fitch was off on is that Citizens United did create a gateway for unlimited spending. And I'm sure we have philosophical disagreements on that, but it's a reality that we have to, and that's why I asked that question is how do we create one definition for a political committee that also abides by that, but doesn't just go into like something that people who want to see the restraint can be satisfied as well.
I guess I should read Citizen June. Huh?
Well,
Don't do it.
What was
Chair's like,
that?
Don't do it.
he said, "Don't." He was highly advising Representative Lane to you
Yeah,
know,
don't ruin my week.
maybe
by
have a
reading.
glass of wine beforehand. Maybe have a glass.
Well, because I think it was relied on transparency and on disclosure as, you know, you can have free speech, but you have to know who's giving the speech is kind of how I've always thought of it as. So, but so I don't know about unlimited. I still,
Well,
it
anyways,
kind of freaks me out.
we,
but yeah.
we will solve that, not today, but that's
Yeah.
that was the point of my question, was how do
Yeah.
you how do
Right.
we have one definition that balances that without
Right. Okay.
having 9 different definitions of PAC, which is what we have now.
All
Right, there are things to create or problems to solve that can take a lot of discussion before
Okay.
can arrive at a mutually agreeable solution, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
All right, then are we all satisfied to adjourn this meeting? Then the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, and thank you, esteemed members of the public, for being here and being interested. Thank you.